One person, one choice. 5 minutes that stood between civilization and ash. On a September night in 1983, a man sat in a bunker south of Moscow, watching screens that glowed in the darkness. Stanislav Petrov was tired. He was filling in for someone else, working a shift he wasn't supposed to work. His wife was sick at home. He had the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when life presses from too many directions at once. And then, just after midnight, warning lights flooded the room in red. Sirens split the silence. The computers were screaming that America had just launched nuclear missiles toward the Soviet Union. Everything Petrov had been trained to do pointed toward one action: pick up the phone, report the attack, set in motion the Soviet response that would send their own missiles arcing across the pole toward American cities. Within hours, most human life would simply cease. The question wasn't whether he should act. The question was whether he would. But Stanislav Petrov did something that still feels impossible when you think about it too carefully. He looked at those flashing screens, listened to those screaming alarms, felt the eyes of every other officer in that bunker waiting for him to follow protocol. And he made a choice that went against everything he was supposed to do. He decided not to believe his computers. He decided to trust something quieter than all that noise. And because of that choice, you are here. I am here. Everyone you've ever known is here. Yet for decades, almost no one knew his name. To understand what Petrov faced that night, you need to feel the world he was living in. The early 80s weren't just tense between America and the Soviet Union. They were something darker, something that felt like standing on ice that was cracking beneath your feet. The previous decade had seen both superpowers trying something different. Detente, they called it. A relaxation of tensions, careful diplomacy. Treaties that limited some weapons while allowing others. It wasn't friendship, but it was something better than the raw terror of the early Cold War. But by 1980, that brief thaw was over. The ice had refrozen, and now it felt thinner and more dangerous than before. Ronald Reagan had just become president, and he represented everything the Soviet leadership feared most. He didn't talk about managing the Cold War. He talked about winning it. He called their entire system evil. He pushed for military spending that the Soviets couldn't hope to match. And in March of 1983, he announced something that sounded like science fiction, but felt like a knife at the throat. A space-based shield that could intercept Soviet missiles. Star Wars, people called it. But to aging Soviet leaders watching their economy strain and crack, it looked like America preparing to achieve something unthinkable. First strike capability, the ability to attack without fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was struggling in ways that weren't obvious to outsiders, but were painfully clear to anyone inside the system. The economy was stagnating, the war in Afghanistan was bleeding them, and the leadership was old, sick, and deeply paranoid. Yuri Andropov, the general secretary, had run the KGB before taking the top job. He believed, genuinely believed, that America might be preparing to launch a surprise nuclear attack. He'd ordered Soviet intelligence to watch for signs, any signs, that the Americans were getting ready for war. So now you had two superpowers, each convinced the other might strike first, each watching the other with the kind of paranoid intensity that makes mistakes lethal. Then, 3 weeks before Petrov's night shift, something happened that made everything worse. A Korean airliner, Flight 007, wandered off course into Soviet airspace. A Soviet fighter shot it down. 269 people died. The world erupted in outrage. Reagan called it murder. Barbarism. The Soviets insisted they'd been defending their territory from what might have been a spy plane. The truth was probably simpler and sadder. Confusion, bad communication, a tragic mistake. But it didn't matter what the truth was. What mattered was that neither side trusted the other anymore. Not even a little bit. This was the world Stanislav Petrov woke up in every morning. But here's what makes his story so quietly powerful. He wasn't a general or a politician. He wasn't someone who sought out his place in history. He was an engineer who happened to be good with technical systems. He'd been born in 1939 in a small town near Ukraine. He was a baby when Germany invaded. He grew up in the wreckage and rebuilding that followed. His father had been a fighter pilot. His mother had been in the military too. But Petrov himself wasn't drawn to martial glory. He was drawn to how things worked. Circuits and systems and the elegant logic of machines that did what they were designed to do. He studied engineering because it made sense to him in a way that politics and ideology never quite did. He joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces because that is where his skills fit. Not because he was a warrior, but because someone had to monitor these systems they were building, and he understood them better than most. By 44, he'd worked his way to lieutenant colonel overseeing the OCO early warning satellite system. It was new technology, only a few years operational. It was supposed to detect American missile launches by spotting the heat signatures from space. The theory was sound. The practice was still being worked out, and Petrov, because he'd helped develop some of the evaluation procedures, knew exactly where the weak points were. But knowing the systems wasn't the only thing weighing on him that September night. His wife was ill. He was exhausted from covering shifts. He carried all the ordinary worries of middle age, the kind that have nothing to do with nuclear war but everything to do with being human. Money concerns, family health, the quiet erosion of energy that comes when you are not young anymore and life hasn't gotten easier the way you thought it might. He was tired in his body and tired in his soul, and then he had to go sit in front of screens that might, at any moment, tell him the world was ending. Serpukhov -15. That was the name of the facility. A secret bunker 60 miles south of Moscow, buried where American missiles would take a few extra minutes to reach. The monitoring room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of screens and the soft lights of control panels. Petrov's job was straightforward on paper. Watch for signs of American missile launches. If the satellites detected anything, assess the data and report it up the chain of command. He wasn't authorized to make final decisions about whether to launch Soviet missiles in response, but his assessment would be the first critical step. Everything that followed would be based on what he told his superiors was happening. The shift started like any other, quiet routine. The kind of boredom that fills military installations everywhere, when nothing is happening and everyone is waiting for something that will probably never come. And then, without warning, everything changed. The computer systems lit up. One missile detected, launched from the United States, heading towards Soviet territory. Alarms shrieked. Red lights pulsed. The word launch flashed across his screen like an accusation. Other officers in the bunker turned to look at him. Everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. Petrov was supposed to pick up the phone and inform Soviet High Command that an attack had begun. But his hand didn't reach for the phone. Not yet. Because something about this felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. One missile, just one. He stared at the data streaming across his screens, trying to make it make sense. The Americans had thousands of nuclear weapons ready to launch. If they'd actually decided to start a nuclear war, they wouldn't send one missile. They'd send everything they had. The entire point of a first strike was overwhelming force. Destroy as many Soviet missiles on the ground as possible before they could launch. One missile accomplished nothing except guaranteeing American cities would burn in retaliation. It was strategically nonsensical, but the computer didn't care about strategy. It cared about heat signatures and trajectory calculations. And right now it was telling him, with high confidence, that a missile was in flight. He could feel the pressure building in the room. Seconds were ticking by. If a missile was really coming, every second of delay meant less time for Soviet commanders to decide whether to retaliate before their own launch systems were destroyed. Then it got worse. The system detected a second missile. Then a third, fourth, fifth, 5 missiles total, all supposedly heading toward Soviet territory. The alarms intensified. The other officers were getting agitated now. The protocol was clear. 5 missiles wasn't one anymore. This was starting to look more serious. Petrov felt the weight of every eye in that bunker pressing on him, but even with 5 missiles, his engineering mind was screaming that something was wrong. 5 was more than one, yes, but it still wasn't enough. It still wasn't how the Americans would actually start a war. They had game-planned nuclear scenarios for decades. Their doctrine was based on massive retaliation. 5 missiles were too many to be an accident, but too few to be an attack. It was a number that didn't fit anything rational. And despite the computers, despite the alarms, despite the protocol, Petrov believed that American leaders were rational. They wouldn't commit suicide without a strategic reason. He also kept coming back to his training as an engineer. This satellite system was new. It had never been tested under real attack conditions. False alarms were possible, maybe even probable. The satellites detected missiles by reading heat against the cold background of space. But other things could create similar heat signatures. The sun reflecting off clouds at certain angles. High-altitude weather phenomena. Glitches in the sensors or the processing algorithms. The technology was sophisticated, but sophistication and reliability aren't the same thing. And there was another piece of data. The ground-based radar systems weren't showing anything, They should have picked up the missiles by now if they were real. The fact that only the satellites were detecting launches suggested the satellites might be lying. But knowing all of this didn't make the decision easier. Because Petrov also knew what would happen if he was wrong. If American missiles were actually in flight and he reported a system malfunction instead of an attack, Soviet leadership wouldn't know they needed to respond until it was too late. By the time the missiles started detonating over Soviet cities, the chance for retaliation would be gone. He would have handed America a successful first strike. He would be responsible for the end of the Soviet Union and the deaths of everyone he'd ever known. The pressure of that moment is almost impossible to imagine. He wasn't sitting in a comfortable office with time to consult experts. He was in a bunker with sirens screaming and officers demanding answers, and computers insisting the attack was real. Every instinct toward self-preservation said follow protocol. Report the attack. Let someone else make the final decision. Cover yourself. Do what you are trained to do. Don't stick your neck out. But Petrov picked up the phone, and when he did, he told his superiors that the computer alerts appeared to be false alarms. System malfunction, not an attack. He was betting civilization on his judgment that the technology was failing. The next 20 minutes felt longer than years. If he was wrong, Soviet cities would start vanishing in nuclear fire in about 30 minutes from the supposed launch time. Every minute that passed without detonation was evidence he might be right. But might wasn't certain, and there was no way to be certain until either missiles fell or they didn't. He watched the screens. He watched the clock. The other officers in the bunker were questioning him, arguing with him. The computer was still reporting an attack with high confidence. Petrov had violated his training, violated protocol, violated the explicit instructions of the technology that was supposed to remove human error from the equation, and he had no way to know if he just saved the world or doomed it until time proved him right or wrong. But the clock kept ticking. The ground radar kept showing nothing. And slowly, minute by excruciating minute, it became clear that no missiles were coming. The satellite system had malfunctioned. Investigators later determined it was probably sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds at exactly the right angle to look like rocket exhaust. A rare alignment of atmospheric conditions, satellite position, and timing that created a nearly perfect false alarm. Technology doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was detect heat signatures, but not what it needed to do, which was accurately distinguish between missiles and clouds. Petrov had been right. His engineering skepticism had been justified. His strategic reasoning had been sound. His instinct had saved more lives than anyone can really count. But what happened next reveals something important about institutions and how they respond to uncomfortable truths. The Soviet military wasn't pleased. Yes, Petrov had been correct, but he'd also violated protocol. He'd inserted human judgment into a system specifically designed to remove it. From the perspective of his superiors, this was a problem. What if the next time there really was an attack and an officer hesitated just like Petrov had done? What if someone made the wrong judgment call and delayed Soviet retaliation long enough for American missiles to destroy their launch capabilities? The whole point of launch on warning was speed. Petrov had introduced doubt and hesitation. That wasn't what the system wanted. There was also the uncomfortable fact that Petrov's correct decision exposed major flaws in expensive new technology. The Soviet military had invested heavily in these satellite systems. Admitting that they nearly triggered an accidental nuclear war was embarrassing at best, catastrophic to credibility at worst. It was easier to classify the incident, bury it quietly, and move on. So Petrov received neither punishment nor praise. He wasn't court-martialed. He wasn't given a medal. The incident was simply classified secret. He was reassigned to less sensitive work. He eventually took early retirement in 1984. His career effectively ended by making a decision that was too correct to acknowledge. He went home to a small apartment with his pension and lived quietly. For years, almost no one knew what he'd done. The hundreds of millions of people who would have died in the initial nuclear blasts lived on, unaware they'd been hours from annihilation. The billions more who would have starved in the nuclear winter that followed continued their ordinary lives. Civilization wasn't destroyed, but because no one knew it had almost been destroyed, no one knew to be grateful. The immediate consequence of Petrov's decision was that nuclear war didn't happen that night. But the longer-term consequences are harder to trace and may be just as significant. The autumn of 1983 was the most dangerous period of the entire Cold War, and most people living through it had no idea. The false alarm that Petrov caught was just one of several near catastrophes that fall. Later that November, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer. It was supposed to be a routine training operation, but Soviet intelligence misinterpreted it as possible preparation for a real attack. Soviet nuclear forces went on high alert. Years later, declassified documents revealed that some Soviet commanders were genuinely considering preemptive strikes. The world came very close to ending multiple times that autumn, and none of it was public knowledge until decades later. Some historians believe the genuine danger of that period eventually contributed to a shift in how both sides thought about nuclear weapons. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev had taken power in the Soviet Union. He began pursuing arms reduction with real urgency. Reagan, despite his earlier rhetoric about winning the Cold War, engaged in serious negotiations. They signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. The Cold War began winding down. Whether the close calls of 1983 played a direct role is impossible to prove. But it is hard to believe that leaders on both sides, when they learned how close they'd come, didn't feel some renewed urgency about stepping back from the brink. The truth about Petrov's decision emerged slowly. In the late 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and archives began opening, a retired Soviet officer mentioned the incident in a memoir. Journalists started investigating. The story was picked up by people who studied nuclear weapons and near misses. By the early 2000s, Petrov's name was becoming known, at least among people who cared about how close we'd come. In 2006, he was invited to the United Nations in New York. He met with American officials and peace activists who wanted to thank him. He received awards. He was honored at ceremonies. He gave interviews, though he always seemed a little uncomfortable with the attention. He kept insisting he wasn't a hero. He was just an officer who'd done his job as best he understood it. He'd made a technical assessment and reported it. That was all. And in one sense, he was right. He wasn't trying to save the world that night. He was trying to give an accurate evaluation of satellite data. His skepticism came from his engineering background, not from moral philosophy. His doubt about the attack came from strategic reasoning, not pacifist principles. These were professional judgments, not acts of conscience. Someone else in his position with the same technical knowledge might have made the same call. There was nothing superhuman about what he did, but historians who study the incident recognize something Petrov was too modest to claim: his willingness to trust those professional judgments against direct computer evidence. An explicit military protocol required a particular kind of courage. The easy choice, the safe choice, the choice that would have protected him personally, was to follow the rules, report what the computer said. Let someone higher up make the hard call. The system was designed to make that the default. Petrov's decision to pause, to question, to evaluate when everything around him was demanding immediate action. That was remarkable. Not because it was superhuman, but because it was human. In a situation specifically designed to remove humanity from the equation. Some historians argue that the deterrence system would have held even if Petrov had reported the attack. They point out that Soviet leadership would have had their own decision to make. When the reported American missiles didn't actually impact Soviet territory, commanders would have realized it was a false alarm. The system had multiple layers. Human judgment existed at multiple points. One mistaken report wouldn't necessarily have triggered a full response, but other historians are less confident. They note that launch-on warning was designed for speed precisely because Soviet leaders feared their missiles would be destroyed on the ground. Once information starts flowing up a military chain of command saying an attack is in progress, momentum builds. Each level of command expects confirmation, not contradiction. The institutional pressure to act decisively becomes immense. And in 1983, Soviet leadership was genuinely paranoid. Andropov really did believe an American first strike was possible. Whether someone higher up the chain would have had the presence of mind to stop the process is far from certain. Petrov's decision not to start that process in the first place may have been crucial. What is undeniable is that the early warning systems both superpowers relied on had serious flaws. False alarms happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. In 1979, American computers briefly showed a full Soviet attack when someone accidentally loaded a training tape into the system. In 1980, a failed computer chip caused American systems to report a massive Soviet launch. Both were caught quickly, but they showed how dependent nuclear decision Making had become on complex technology that wasn't always reliable. The September '83 incident went further than the others. It was the one that came closest to actually triggering a nuclear response. But it was part of a pattern of dangerous errors that revealed the whole system was more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. And this raises questions that still feel urgent today. The nuclear deterrence system that dominated the Cold War was built on certain assumptions. That leaders would be rational, that information would be accurate, that the people making decisions would have time to think. But Petrov's story shows how thin those assumptions actually were. Information wasn't always accurate. Technology could fail in unpredictable ways, and the time available for decision making was measured in minutes, which meant careful thought was impossible. The difference between continuing civilization and ending it came down to individual human judgment in situations where that judgment wasn't encouraged, wasn't expected, and certainly wasn't rewarded. There is something deeply unsettling about building a system like that. Billions of people going about their ordinary lives owed their continued existence to decisions they didn't even know were being made, by people they'd never heard of, in circumstances they had no control over. The structure of nuclear deterrence required split-second decisions. That requirement meant careful deliberation was a luxury no one could afford. It meant trusting imperfect technology because there wasn't time to verify. It meant putting individuals like Petrov in positions where they had to make civilization-level decisions without civilization-level authority. But there is also something profound in how Petrov responded. He faced a situation that was designed to have no ambiguity. Computers said attack, protocol said report, but he recognized that human judgment still mattered. His technical knowledge told him the computers might be wrong. His understanding of nuclear strategy told him the attack scenario didn't make sense, and critically, he was willing to trust those assessments, even when they conflicted with explicit authority. He was willing to take personal risk, to face potential consequences, to be catastrophically wrong if he was wrong, all because he believed his evaluation was correct. That kind of judgment can't be automated. It requires experience, knowledge, and the willingness to take responsibility for decisions that could be wrong in ways that destroy everything. In an age that increasingly trusts algorithms and automatic systems, Petrov's story is a reminder that some decisions can't be safely automated. Some situations require a human being who can evaluate context, recognize when things don't add up, and choose to pause when every system is screaming to act immediately. Stanislav Petrov died in May 2017. He was 77 years old. He spent his final years living modestly in a small town outside Moscow. Getting by on his pension, he never became wealthy. He never became truly famous despite what he'd done. In interviews near the end of his life, he expressed mixed feelings about the attention his story received. He was proud of his decision, but uncomfortable being called a hero, and he worried that focusing on his individual choice let people avoid thinking about the larger problem that nuclear weapons existed at all. That systems were built that required one person to save everyone else. He was right to worry about that. It is easier to tell stories about individual heroes than to think seriously about systemic dangers. It is more comfortable to focus on Petrov's good judgment than to reckon with the fact that the world shouldn't have been in a position where everything depended on one officer's judgment in the first place. The story shouldn't be that Petrov saved the world. The story should be that the world needed saving, and that was insane. But there is still value in remembering what he did. It reminds us that history isn't only made by the famous people, whose names everyone knows. Sometimes history is made by individuals in technical positions, who recognize when their systems are failing and choose to trust themselves over their machines. It reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it is quiet doubt in the face of certain authority. Sometimes it is the willingness to be wrong, to accept the consequences because you believe you are probably right. The world Stanislav Petrov saved continued on, mostly unaware it had been saved. On September 27, 1983, people woke up and lived their normal lives. They had no idea they'd come hours from not waking up at all. Children went to school, people went to work, nations pursued their interests. The Cold War continued for 6 more years before ending peacefully. None of it would have happened if one tired engineer in a bunker had simply done what his computers told him to do. In our current age, we're building increasingly complex automated systems. We're creating algorithms that make decisions faster and with more data than any human could process. There is real value in that. But Petrov's story offers a different perspective. It suggests that there are moments when human intuition, informed by experience and understanding, can see things that technology can't. When the pattern doesn't match, when the numbers say one thing but something deeper says another, and it suggests that building space for that human judgment, even when it slows things down, even when it complicates clear chains of command, might be essential for survival. There is a quieter lesson here too, about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. Petrov wasn't brave because he charged into danger. He was brave because he stood still when everyone expected him to act. He was brave because he trusted his own mind when every external source of authority said he was wrong. That is a different kind of strength than we usually celebrate. But it might be the kind that matters most. The willingness to pause, to think, to question, even when, especially when, everything is telling you to hurry. If this story means something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And think about the systems in your own life where speed is valued over reflection, where following protocol is rewarded over questioning it, where technology makes decisions and humans just implement them. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is exactly what Petrov did. Stop, think, trust the part of yourself that knows something isn't right, even when you can't immediately prove it. The world didn't end on September 26, 1983. Not because the system worked, but because one person understood that sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is refuse to act at all. And everyone alive today owes him a debt we can never fully repay. The least we can do is remember his name.